Oh, there it is. There it is. I think that will work. So I would say Mark has kind of preempted some of my introductory remarks, and I hope what follows lives up to the billing. This is the first of the 3 Clyne lectures I will give, and it's my perspective on what I would call the extraordinary cultural impact of post-World War II literary culture. I'm going to be talking about books, about the people who write them, and particularly the people who publish them. And I have to begin by repeating that I'm grateful to Mark and to the board of Green College for luring me into doing this. You've heard about the Vancouver Institute talk. That one will be much more anecdotal and will focus much more on my experience building Douglas and McIntyre. So this initial talk is on the Golden Age and the role some publishers played in it. Let me see if I can manage this. The third talk, the second one again, is In the Shadow of Two Empires. The third talk will look at the international institutional environment which allows the creative industries to flourish. And I'll talk about my role in the UNESCO Convention and all of that political side of what was an interesting career, in my view at least. So let me offer a few words about my point of view. I firmly believe that publishers, who are very different creatures from editors, are the ones who have been the guiding figures shaping this evolution. The great publisher and CEO of Penguin, an old friend of mine actually, Peter Mayer, summed it up succinctly. The modern publisher must have the soul of an editor and the brain of an accountant, able to handle simultaneously the demands of recalcitrant authors and complex strategic plans. The whole question of conflict between culture and commerce only comes up when the strategies have been inadequate. Publishers come in many forms and guises, and my own experience is that of a trade publisher creating general books for a broad readership rather than textbooks, specialist publications, or scholarly monographs, and although the broader picture will be touched upon. General trade publishing is the most culturally influential and personally rewarding of publishing disciplines. It is also by far the least profitable. But before reaching what I am calling the Golden Age, the scene should be set. And I should warn you that you will find Canada invisible in this first talk for a combination of reasons, one of which is the anecdotes I felt constrained by telling too many stories which prevailed. My second talk will explain why and properly flesh out the Canadian story. So World War I had been hugely disruptive to UK publishing, with businesses being stripped of their employees for the agony of the European front, and paper rationing becoming the norm for the first time. Yet despite that, the book business prospered as people both at home and in the trenches found solace, inspiration, and courage between the covers of a book. Following that war, publishing grew exponentially, and many of the companies that command the most respect today were established or reached maturity. In London, they included Chatto & Windus, actually founded in 1855, Jonathan Cape, founded in 1922, Faber & Faber, 1929, and Penguin, 1935 amongst them. In New York, during the same period, such distinguished houses as Alfred Knopf, actually founded in 1915, Simon & Schuster, founded by Dick Simon, Carly's father, and Max Schuster in 1926, with their joint savings of $6,000 and weekly salaries of $20 each. And Random House, of course, in 1927, and they opened the door to a whole new scale of independent publishing. Almost all were run by fiercely independent men from backgrounds of privilege, supported by significant financial resources, often family money. With the consequent flourishing of the other print media, newspapers and magazines, writers became household names. And in spite of the upheavals of the war, sales boomed. American writers in particular enjoyed the best of all possible worlds. The home market was rapidly expanding, but they could also escape to Paris, where the franc was worth very little There was a palpable cultural buzz in the air, and the restrictive moral regime prevailing in the U.S. was far away across an ocean. Expatriates Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Dos Passos, Sinclair Lewis, and Carlos Williams, to name but a few, burst out of the shadows during the 1920s. And they were canonized by Gertrude Stein's memorable description of them all as the lost generation. The 1930s and the Depression were far less disruptive to book publishing than to most other categories of enterprise. And such transformative innovations as Alan Lane's Penguin paperbacks were broadening the UK market. Book clubs, which had flourished there in the early years of the 20th century, were reinvented to boost flagging sales. In the US, book clubs began reaching broad new publics, led by Book of the Month Club, established in 1926. And a new generation of writers pushed the limits of language and cultural barriers while with compelling stories, although the long shadow and deep social disillusionment of World War I lingered. World War II brought a renewed shortage of manpower and again a highly regulated paper supply. In the UK, conditions were so bad that many of the classics, previously the cornerstone of publishers' financial stability, were driven out of print, both because of lack of paper and government's decision to order the melting down of standard lead type for munitions. I'm just going to get some water here. London endured the Blitz, which destroyed many established publishers' offices and warehouses, although ironically enough, not their financial results. As most publishers had remained in London, insurance claims for warehouses destroyed in the bombing helped refinance a number of them. More importantly, the thirst for books continued, and much of what was printed sold out quickly. A new reading public was emerging, eager to embrace good writing of all kinds. Government considered books an essential catalyst in maintaining public morale. Sir Stanley Unwin, always pithy and frequently cantankerous, summed it up. He commented on a useful evening routine. Commend yourself to God, read a book, go to sleep. In the US, publishers established the Council on Books in Wartime, a cooperative venture dedicated to inspiring defiance by distributing cheap paperbacks to U.S. troops abroad. And between 1943 and 1946, some 123 million copies of 1,300 current bestsellers were manufactured as armed forces editions for about 6 cents a copy. The world's changed. As but one example, The Great Gatsby, which had been reviewed as a dud upon its 1925 publication, suddenly enjoyed a print run of 155,000 copies, which lifted it from obscurity. This program was hugely influential in instilling a passion and a habit for reading amongst the American public, and is credited with kick-starting post-war American literary culture. Throwing glib phrases such as golden age around is always problematic. I mean, history is a continuing, yet exceptional patterns do emerge from time to time. For book publishing, in my view and that of many others, the era following World War II offers one of them. Once the war was over, and following a relatively brief period of readjustment, the full impact of a new world revealed itself. Key employees began returning home. Paperback rationing diminished gradually, although it lingered on until 1952 in the UK. Established companies were experiencing fresh energy, and a new young generation of writers had visceral stories to tell. There was a profound belief that anything was possible, particularly in the United States, where a growing population and steadily rising incomes boosted the burgeoning optimism. Publishing houses, bookstores, and consequently authors all flourished in an explosion of books and places where the public could find them. Film, theater, and music retained their important roles, but books were the defining cultural medium. In London, a fresh infusion of energy from the German, Austrian, Jewish diaspora fleeing the Nazis brought innovation and chutzpah, particularly to new forms such as art books, which had flourished on the continent but had languished in the hide-bombed old-school publishing houses in the UK. While many of the new houses built by these driven publishers have now been subsumed into larger multinationals, during the post-war years, optimism overcame doubt. Publishing was still fueled more by ideas than by money, and the market was responding. I'm going to just take this off. Excuse me for a sec. There we go. Andre Deutsch, John le Carré based his recurring character, Toby Esterhazy, on him, and his longtime editor, Diana Athill, were publishing adventuresome fiction from both sides of the Atlantic. Amongst those new voices were V.S. Naipaul, Jean Rice, John Updike, Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, and Mordecai Richler, and actually Peggy Atwood as well, but that was later on. Walter Neurath and his wife Eva, newly arrived from Vienna, launched Thames and Hudson in 1949. They named the company after the two rivers, and in so doing transformed art book publishing. Their founding mantra was to create a museum without walls, and their cornerstone series, The World of Art, established in 1958, still has over 300 titles in print. My company represented T&H in Canada for many years, and it was instructive to encounter their operation at work. Shabby offices in Bloomsbury, passionate involvement by the principals in every aspect of their books, an effective international network for sharing co-editions, thus making ambitious art books where the cost of color separations and printing was prohibitive, more effective, and good international distribution through their own companies. Even Neurath was famous for disdaining the chaotic flow of the floor of the Frankfurt Book Fair. Indeed, she operated out of a suite in the Frankfurter Hof, the most exclusive and expensive hotel in that trading city. Also had the best bar. Getting a suite there during the fair was akin to getting into Harvard. Long odds bring money, connections help. And Eva maintained a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce at her disposal, which is still in the company, a source of much amusement amongst the salesmen who occasionally get to drive it. George Weidenfeld and his business partner, Nigel Nicholson, son of Harold Nicholson and Vita Sackville West, formed Weidenfeld and Nicholson in 1948. George was infamous for his unparalleled connections amongst the rich and famous in the UK and Europe, whose memoirs and biographies he specialized in publishing. A competitor who eventually bought the failing company and merged it into what is now Orion once suggested sarcastically, George knew everyone, but we wouldn't let him near the money. Paul Hamlin, born in Germany in 1926, launched his company in 1949, and taking advantage of new developments in offset printing, made his first fortune publishing inexpensive books full of color for the masses. He didn't believe in warehouses, selling his books by the skid rather than by the title, significantly to department stores, and shipping them directly from the binder to his many domestic and international distributors. He hugely broadened the market for popular illustrated books. He was to rise phoenix-like in several new iterations over the years, one of which was Octopus Books, now part of Hachette. Perhaps the most influential of all, at least initially, was Robert Maxwell, a Czech immigrant who built Pergamum into a scientific, technical, and medical colossus by shamelessly taking advantage of academics desperate to get published. He virtually invented that genre of publishing as it exists today. During his meteoric career, often using other people's money, someone once described him, and accurately I think, as uniquely brilliant, uniquely profitable, and uniquely dishonest. He was eventually forced by business pressures to sell his beloved company to Reed Elsevier, the huge Anglo-Dutch publishing house that is now the world's largest by dollar volume. And in 1991, In deep personal financial trouble, he stepped off the deck of his luxury yacht near the Canary Islands and drowned in an apparent suicide. Ernest Hecht, founder of Souvenir Press, who died just last year, was the last of the great émigré publishers and, like the others, defiantly independent. Having founded his company in 1951 with a 250-pound loan from his father, his eclectic list grew to include everything from books about dogs and cats to the work of 5 Nobel laureates, including Knut Hansen and Pablo Neruda, and P.G. Wodehouse, Albert Einstein, and such rebellious spirits as Che Guevara and Thor Heyerdahl. His 2 great passions were rock and roll. He virtually invented the genre of publishing in the UK, and sport, specifically soccer, which led him for a time to act as Pelé's literary agent. There were simpler times. His passions made him a great deal of money and allowed him to split his time between a large house in London and a canal house in Amsterdam, while disdaining book fairs and concentrating instead on his own charitable foundation. We once together polished off a bottle of champagne, pontificating on the state of the world, why soccer is better than what we call football, and why Shirley MacLaine's crumpled bathing suit sat in a corner of his office. That story, alas, of course, is not for this occasion. In those decades after World War II, the established houses in the UK began to thrive again, amongst them Penguin, in an echo of the US circumstance, providing cheap books for the troops, Collins, Castles, John Murray, Chatto & Windus, Jonathan Cape, Faber and Faber. There was a wonderfully tight-knit cadre of independent publishers, most of whom were thriving then. Design standards had improved significantly, and both domestic and international markets were booming. One of the great type designers of the age, the Bauhaus-influenced designer Jan Schickhold, created the elegant and restrained Penguin look, in the process revolutionizing international book design. And of course, it was the writers and their talent that really made everything possible. Even a truncated short list of seminal UK writers from that period would have to include George Orwell, Graham Greene. These lists get too long. Anthony Powell, Ian Fleming, John le Carré, William Golding, Iris Murdoch, Muriel Spark, Anthony Burgess, Martin Amis, the Durrell brothers, and Patrick Leigh Fermor. Such defining figures as T.S. Eliot, himself both a shareholder in and an editor at Faber, the conscience of its distinguished poetry list, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Dylan Thomas, Evelyn Waugh, W.H. Auden, were continuing to publish groundbreaking work, often pushing, this is what happens to me, often pushing the limits of the language. Noble literary publishing was one thing, profitable commerce was still essential. Ian Fleming and James Bond kept Cape alive well into the 1970s, before it was eventually subsumed into Random House. The musical Cats, based very loosely on T.S. Eliot's children's verses, kept Faber and Faber alive through the 1980s, and to this day allows it to remain independent. Lady Chatterley's Lover, reprinted by Penguin in 1960 with a license for which they paid £1,000, pushed the boundaries of the new Obscene Publications Act of 1960 and broke through legal barriers that until then had kept such books out of the market. It went on to sell 3 million copies, allowing Penguin to go public in 1961. And Winston Churchill, who had chosen Cassels for his multi-volume histories of World War II and the English-speaking peoples because of previous kindnesses, almost single-handedly kept that company in business. I'm going to have to do this. At the same time, illustrated books found new life. Advances in offset printing technology, which made color plates relatively inexpensive, in combination with printing being done cheaply in Eastern Europe and later in Asia, liberated the making of all illustrated books, and not just those of Paul Hamlin. A new breed of publishers known as packagers began creating more ambitious illustrated publishing projects, which they sold to established companies that didn't have the staff or the expertise to undertake such luxurious publishing. George Rainbird originated the genre, and it was taken up by an expanding universe of new entrants, the most notable of which was Dorling Kindersley, established in 1975. Their first huge international success was the illustrated Joy of Sex, although reviewers complained about the overly hirsute male who was prominently displayed. Packagers' stock in trade was selling large quantities of complicated illustrated books to existing houses with good distribution, usually making very slim profit margins on those books and relying on the volume of sales to cover their substantial overheads. Technical improvements to the binding of books led to an explosion of paperback publishing and the consequent establishment of new specialized houses. The conventional wisdom in the business was that hardcover and paperback publishing were very different activities and should be done by separate entities. Penguin thrived in such an environment, and new houses such as Penn, a joint venture by a number of existing hardcover houses, Corgi and Fontana, amongst others, emerged as market powers with massive print runs and diversified distribution to such new categories of outlets as railway stations, grocery stores, and drugstores. While financial turnover for the old houses was almost laughably small by today's standards, operating profits were consistently in the 5 to 10% range, and the owners lived well. William Billy Collins lived and entertained in an elegant townhouse facing St. James Square in London. Domestic staff and luxury cars were common, and many maintained country houses for visits between their travels to France. Throughout this period, the bedrock of stability for the UK book trade was something called the Netbook Agreement, established in 1900 to legally protect the retail prices at which bookstores could offer books for sale to the public. While it caused much angst in free market quarters, this agreement was considered essential to the financial health of both publishers and booksellers, and was staunchly defended until formally falling apart, but not until 1997. It prevented discounting and therefore the rise of the mass merchandisers, amongst which the current leader is Amazon with over 50% of the UK market. By the 1960s, change was in the air in the world of UK publishing. Rising inflation, increased competition from the US, the rise of literary agents winning ever larger royalty advances for saleable books, and the inexorably escalating costs of the back office, warehousing, shipping, data processing, and financial administration. A changing and more demanding retail environment characterized by higher discounts and greater returns, and fragmenting literary tastes amongst the post-war generation altogether conspired to force amalgamations, sales, and mergers, pushing the creation of larger entities. At the same time, many established houses were confronting the urgent need for a new generation to take charge. At the beginning of that decade, most publishers were still male, privately educated Oxbridge graduates with private incomes who frequented the Garrick Club. The founders, men such as Geoffrey Faber and T.S. Eliot at Faber, Alan Lane at Penguin, Jonathan Cape, Billy Collins at Collins, Sir Stanley and his son at Allen and Unwin, and much of the rest of their generation were aging, and their companies were struggling financially. It was time for a regime change. Some of the new blood dramatically revolutionized the companies they grew to lead. Tom Mashler at Cape, Matt, now Sir Matthew Evans at Faber, and later Peter Mayer at Penguin come to mind. The pressures of scale dictated change. Cape bought Chatto and Witness and eventually the Bodley Head. Bell and Hyman merged with Allen and Unwin, only to be acquired by HarperCollins in 1989. Headline bought Hodder and Stoughton and eventually added John Murray. Macmillan was sold to von Holsbrink, and even the mighty Penguin was acquired by Pearson Longman, owned by the S. Pearson Company, whose holdings included the Financial Times, Royal Doulton China, and even Chateau Latour in the Médoc. Under the ruthless Rupert Murdoch, Collins was merged with Harper & Row to become HarperCollins. Dorling Kindersley committed the folly of vastly overpaying Lucasfilm for the Star Wars franchise, only to overprint by 13 million unsaleable units, and be forced to turn to Pearson Educational for a rescue. There were exceptions, of course. Paul Hamlin reinvented himself under the guise of Octopus Books with some of Robert Maxwell's money and was able to go public. And Penguin, under Peter Mayer, continued to buy legacy companies, Frederick Warren, Hamish Hamilton, Michael Joseph, George Rainbird, finally to itself bought by Bertelsmann and merged with Random House in 2013. Even the magisterial university presses of Oxford and Cambridge were forced by significant financial pressures to restructure and bring in new management. The elegiac chapter about the 1980s in Ian Stevenson's definitive book on the UK scene is simply titled The End of the Affair. What had been established and developed as a small-scale cottage industry for gentlemen was forced to embrace the fickle mass market and an increasingly digital future, for better or for worse. Many of the most distinguished imprints are now only names or have disappeared entirely into the maw of larger entities. But their authors' books remain, and they remain available and still constitute the cornerstones of contemporary culture. Across the Atlantic, and I'm just looking at time here, okay. Across the Atlantic, meanwhile, publishing experienced a parallel and even greater unleashing of energy and growth. At the end of the war, American publishing echoed the structure of UK publishing, with mostly small companies still owned and run by their founders. And while most of them had, one way or another, found money from family and friends, they ran their companies as personal fiefdoms. There was an abundance of talent, wonderful writers to be found and nurtured, a loyal and prosperous network of several thousand independent bookstores, good and developed public libraries, and an exponentially rising new population of university students, many back from the war and empowered by the GI Bill to continue their education. Now, a highly competitive base of both established and new publishers, helped in their search for new writers by aggressive literary agents, took advantage of ready supplies of paper, new channels of distribution, and typically brash American sales and marketing techniques to shape a new ecology for writing and publishing. The media had the time and the passion to take books and publishing seriously. Hollywood was increasingly becoming the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for writers. There was a palpable excitement amongst the American public for new voices which were still reaching their publics primarily through the medium of books. The sky seemed the limit, and often it was. Two significant differences, I think, between UK and US publishing widened the Atlantic gap, although distribution, co-publishing, and ever more effective international travel to such marketing opportunities as the Frankfurt Book Fair, quickly reestablished after the war, were beginning to narrow it. Book design and production standards were generally higher in the US than in the UK, particularly because of the more abundant supply of quality paper and binding materials and the lively graphic culture of New York. More significantly, editing improved, and a generation of dedicated and talented US editors brought intense discipline to the ever more professional and sometimes even lucrative activity. A cliche in the business is that American editors rewrite, UK editors don't touch, and Canadian editors are someplace in the middle. But that is another story, not for now. The differences have lessened now, but editing in the good US houses remains the height of the craft, essential to effective author development and good publishing. My biases will show, but I think of exceptional houses such as Knopf, Farstraus Giroux, Scribner's, Simon & Schuster, Norton, Random House, Viking, Harper & Row, Doubleday, Grove, Houghton Mifflin, Little Brown, Morrow, Harcourt, Brace, all constantly competing for new authors. And all were run at that time by charismatic and fully engaged executives. Editors had both the time and the passion to nurture their writers. So, such new houses as Athenaeum, itself a startup partnership of 3 senior bookmen, Simon Michael Bessie, Hiram Hayden, and Pat Knopf, Alfred's son, quite a charismatic guy, I can tell you, were launching bestsellers. Hands-on editors, and I'm not going to read this list, amongst them many, Sam Vaughan, Jason Epstein, Michael Korda, Robert Gottlieb, Nan Talese, still Margaret Atwood's editor, U.S. editor, Cork Smith, who published Leonard Cohen, Ken McCormick, Robert Giroux, and too many more to name, were defining literary taste with the full support of their publishers, allowing a generation of new authors and their books to enter the pantheon. The paperback revolution crossed the Atlantic to the U.S., where it achieved new scale. Historically, hardcover publishers had licensed their paperback rights to specialist paperback houses, which provided a steady stream of income to the hardcover houses. That in turn allowed them to pay larger advances, increasingly necessary in the age of powerful literary agents. The paperback revolution began in America when Ian Ballantine and his wife Betty, who only died this year at age 99, opened an American office for Allen Lane of Penguin in 1939 with a one-room office and for capital a wedding dowry of $500 from Betty's father. 6 years later, he founded Bantam. 7 years after that, the house which still bears his name. And amongst the many authors he introduced to the U.S. were Tolkien and Arthur C. Clarke. One of my many treasured memories is spending an afternoon in the Monkey Bar of the Elysee Hotel in New York with the Ballantines, trading memories and stories, all of them compelling, but none of them to be repeated here, I'm afraid. Other paperback houses soon joined the mix. I'm just keeping, yeah, we're okay. Avon, where Penguin's Peter Mayer got his start, Pocket Books with some financing from Simon & Schuster, Dell, New American Library, shaped by Victor Waybright and Mark Jaffe, Bantam, which later flourished under Austria Diskel, and Fawcett, all reaching a new and dramatically larger public while providing an ongoing source of operating capital to the existing hardcover companies. Book clubs were thriving at a time when direct mail was still well suited to the appetites of a geographically diverse country, and digitally reach was far in the future. Book of the Month Club was the high-end entity, eventually spawning other clubs, including the Quality Paperback Book Club, while the Doubleday clubs reached the mid-market, and focus clubs of all kinds appealed to special interests, such as cooking, sailing, and history. By 1946, Book of the Month Club had reached 550,000 members. A monthly selection of the club, chosen during animated long editorial sessions with a distinguished jury, including at one time Mordecai Richler, in a luxurious dining room high up in the Book of the Month Club building in Midtown Manhattan, could virtually guarantee a book's success and add more than 100,000 copies to a print run. In 1951, only Book of the Month Club's 25th year of operation, the club distributed its 100th millionth book. Appropriately enough, the title was Catcher in the Rye. American writing, both fiction and nonfiction, prospered as never before. The intense partnership between editors and publishers and writers and their publics defined the post-war era and forged the great North American literary inheritance we still treasure. Any list of the iconic names of that era fails to do justice to the breadth and depth of the talent, but consider as a start, here's another of those lists, writers such as Tom Wolfe, Norman Mailer, Jack Kerouac, James Baldwin, Joseph Heller, Rachel Carson, Susan Sontag, J.D. Salinger, James Jones, Gore Vidal, and Mario Puzo. Mario Puzo, sorry. And The Godfather spent 67 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and went on to sell over 9 million copies. Those are the old days. As the years passed UK and US publishing cultures were drawing ever closer together. Increasing scale, sales of territorial rights, more efficient business practices, and new opportunities provided by easy airplane travel, ever cheaper long-distance phone calls, telexes and fax machines meant that the development of a single world market for English language books was booming and seen as increasingly necessary, at least for major Western writers and their publics. I recall a New York agent friend of mine who used to set his alarm for 5 a.m. to avoid the egregious costs of transatlantic long-distance calls later in the day. That's all, of course, if you spend a dime on a long-distance call now, you think it's too much. With UK houses squeezed financially and US houses growing in capacity and agents demanding ever larger royalty advances, the advantages of fiscal size and heft were becoming unavoidable. Ownership alliances inevitably followed, and the seeds of the era of conglomerates were sown. Now, this seems the moment to add a word about the growing contributions of women who were moving beyond the cloistered drudgery of secretarial work to take positions of increasing authority, particularly in such areas as subsidiary and international rights, editing, and promotion. The real impact of this evolution is beyond the scope of this talk, because it didn't reach critical mass until after the 1970s, but women have become such a seminal force in most publishing houses, including my own, that today many of the most powerful figures in international publishing are women. One of the earliest was Blanche Knopf, the yin to Alfred Yang. From the beginning of their personal and business partnership, she scoured the world for new talent, focusing on South America and Europe, partially because Knopf was infamously stingy about paying royalty advances, and new writers from further afield were just happy to be published in the US. Amongst her discoveries were Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, André Gide, Thomas Mann, and Sigmund Freud, all anchoring what was becoming an increasingly respected Knopf program. For European writers, the scale of new American money led one cynic to suggest that publishers were launching their own Marshall Plan. From the many remarkable men who left their indelible mark on the business, let me single out Roger Strauss of Forrest Strauss and Giroux, and not just because we represented the company in Canada for almost 20 years. The company was established in 1946 with Roger Strauss's return from the war. Roger looked and acted every inch the publisher. Flamboyant, accustomed to command, rich in his use of a vocabulary that would make any sailor blush, debonair in dress, pink shirts, ascots, and camel's hair jackets, not immune to martinis, comfortable in Union Square quarters, which were at the time affordable but distinctly seedy. As was the case with many of his colleagues, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His father was a mining magnate, and, and his mother a Guggenheim. He was driven equally by an aggressively competitive ambition and a fierce devotion to literature. From the beginning, he kept his eye on the main chance, and he had a very sharp eye. In partnership with his great literary editor, Robert Giroux, to whom I once sold a book by George Woodcock about Giroux's great idol, Thomas Merton, by the early 2000s, the company had published 17 Nobel Prize winners and built arguably the country's most distinguished fictionalist. Giroux had joined Strauss in 1955, bringing with him such an array of authors that one envious competitor suggested that they together constituted half the literary talent of America at the time. Echoing many other important publishers of his age, his authors always came first, but he was notoriously tough on his editors, of whom I came to know many. Having thrived under Strauss and later Jonathan Galassi, still the company's president and publisher, Forrest Strauss built a brilliant list which made few compromises to commercial intent. Roger himself eventually chose the moment to sell his company in 1994. And with a telephone call to his German publishing colleague, Dieter von Holzbrink, head of the eponymous von Holzbrink Publishing Group, initiated the transaction, for which he was paid a rumored $30 million. Always an exemplar of his motto, the only meaningful efficiency in publishing is excellent taste. Roger died at age 87 in 2004, and alas, I wasn't able to make his memorial event. A second feisty character from this extraordinary time was Barney Rossett, who made history fighting U.S. censorship laws while building Grove into a fine literary house. Also back from the war, he set up with $3,000 in working capital and 2 employees, himself and his wife, in 1951. He too was publishing European as well as American authors, skillfully mixing fiction and nonfiction. By the late 1960s, Grove was thriving, making so much money that it was able to buy its own building in Lower Manhattan to house its then 150 employees. Amongst his many successes, Rossett licensed Waiting for Godot for the U.S. market, which in time sold over 2 million copies. Working in tandem with his editorial director, Dick Seaver, who had a degree in French from the Sorbonne and actually has a kid in Vancouver, his authors and books reflected a prescient literary edge. They included François Sagan, Eugene Ionesco, Frank Harris, William Burroughs, and Malcolm X, among many others. They also included the novels of D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller, previously banned as pornographic, and in defense of which Rossett spent large sums of money fighting existing obscenity laws in court. His Pyrrhic victories changed obscenity law in the U.S., as Alan Lane's Penguin had done in the U.K., but significantly weakened the company treasury. Oblivious to challenges, a colleague once described him as having a whim of steel. Unsurprisingly, he was mercurial in his editorial pursuits. In 1967, when he paid an enormous amount of money for the U.S. distribution rights to the Swedish erotic film I Am Curious Yellow, the obscenity court cases proved a bridge too far. Its financial resources depleted. The company was eventually sold to Ann Getty of the oil dynasty in 1985, and later sold by her to Morgan Entrekin, where it still forms the important backlist of the distinguished U.S. independent house Grove Atlantic. Roger Strauss and Barney Rossett were not untypical of their generation of American publishers. George Braziller of his eponymous house, Tom Ginsberg at Viking, Cass Canfield at Harper & Row, Dick Snyder and Max Schuster at Simon & Schuster, Bennett Cerf of Random House, and many others came from the same mold. Another man cut from the same cloth was the charismatic Canadian publisher, Jack McClelland. Here's the Canadian content. Also a war hero. His story and that of his publishing house will be central to the next talk, where the northern version of the UK-US adventure unfolded. But all good things come to an end. Evolving business pressures and changing markets led to the same necessity for scale that had transformed UK publishing in the 1960s. It's perhaps hard to imagine now, but book publishing had great cachet during its golden age, and publishing houses were pursued by a wide range of conglomerate builders waving fat checks from the worlds of media, entertainment, education, and even munitions. These impulses seem folly now. Hardware companies were convinced that book publishers could bring content and the people with the skills to develop it at a bargain price. But book publishing is by its very nature intransigent, resistant to business imperatives, and dependent upon individual talent. As sales growth slowed in the 1960s, market maturity was blunting financial results, the curse of all investors. A publishing executive friend of mine once lamented with angst in his voice, "Flat is the new up." This was not a world conducive to corporate avarice, and further evolution was inevitable. Still, the lure of fresh money was attractive to the old line houses, where management age and the prospect of punitive inheritance tax, should owners die, led to the first wave of company sales. It began with the early moves by Bennett Cerf and Donald Clougher at Random House. In 1959, they engineered the purchase of Knopf, and a few years later, Pantheon, selling 30% of their stock on Wall Street to finance the expansion. Random House and Knopf combined had total sales of only about $12 million, about the size of Douglas McIntyre, actually. With age catching up to the principals, in 1965, the growing company was sold to RCA, then headed by the very smart General David Sarnoff for $25 million. What the new owners considered only meager profits soon soured the arrangement, and in 1980, the company was sold to Cy Newhouse, the Condé Nast magazine magnate, for $60 million. In 1998, the entire company, which by then included such acquisitions as Ballantine, Crown, and Bantam Doubleday, was sold to the German Bertelsmann Group for $1 billion. The pattern repeated itself throughout the 1970s. In 1975, a few years after the loss of its founding partners, Simon & Schuster was sold to Gulf and Western, and all its publishing units, which by then included the storied Scribner companies, were acquired by Viacom in 1994 and are now part of the CBS Corporation. Time Inc. bought Little Brown, the venerable Boston family company, in 1968, which was then merged with Warner Books in 1990. In 2006, what had become the Time Warner Book Group was sold to the French company Hachette. And that's, by the way, owned by Lagardère, which is a munitions manufacturing company. Rupert Murdoch, already owner of Collins, engineered a Machiavellian coup by taking over Harper & Row to establish what is now HarperCollins, now owners of Harlequin, which a troubled Toronto Star sold for an attractive amount of cash a few years ago. The German competitor to Bertelsmann, the von Holtzbrinck Group, bought Holt Rinehart and Winston in 1985, Farr, Straus and Giroux in 1994, and the entire Macmillan Group, including St. Martin's Press, in 1995. The American holdings of the von Holtzbrinck Group now trade under the Macmillan name because, although I suspect it's just an apocryphal story, Dieter von Holtzbrinck grew frustrated having to explain to New York hotel check-in clerks how to spell his name. The same fate befell all the remaining large U.S. houses, virtually all of which have now been subsumed within conglomerates and face increasing pressure to generate profit and cash flow in an ever more difficult business environment. If the past period was indeed a golden age, and I stand by that judgment, the English-speaking world had moved on by the late 1970s and 1980s into a more competitive, technologically revolutionary, fraught, and challenging global era. The question remains, what has happened to the old ideals of editor-publishers and their writers? Certainly, the pressures of scale and greater profit have forced evolution upon the inner workings of large publishing houses, but in its heart, trade book publishing remains a business of people, built on the talent of risk-taking writers, trust, and human relationships. To function properly, publishing must still reflect that delicate relationship between author and editor, which allows creative work to thrive, even if the process unfolds within a large corporate environment. It is the business model and the mechanisms for reaching the market that have changed, not the relationships which are key to the writing and making of books. There are huge pressures on what is called midlist, which encompasses all those books which do not sell in large quantity, and this is taking a toll. Some believe that the digital revolution, e-books, self-publishing, and digital delivery will deliver us from evil. It's not a view I share. Books, those seditious carriers of distilled ideas, have been with us for almost 3,000 years and show few signs of disappearing. There may be more of everything, and the Amazons, Googles, and Netflixes of this world may yet conquer all. But I'll stick with good storytelling. Books still stubbornly sit at the heart of our culture, and much evidence confirms that they will stay there. They seem more necessary than ever. Thank you. All right.